Hello and welcome to Restoring the Soul, a podcast dedicated to helping you close the gap from what you're meant to be and what keeps you from being all that. I'm your producer, Brian Beatty, welcoming back our host, my good friend, Michael John Cusick, to the microphone. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Mr. Brian.
How have you been? We're here on the cusp of summer.
Yeah, I think we're into summer in Colorado at the higher elevations, but maybe not you at the lower elevations. But doing well, a little bit of vacation, a little bit of work. Glad to be back in front of the screen and the microphone to be able to keep moving forward with our Surfing for God series.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited about this episode. This one that we're going to be getting into today is titled Your Brain on Porn. And this is the first of two episodes that we're going to do related to this topic. Interestingly enough, is the 10th episode that we've set aside here for the Surfing for God series. And before we jump in, Michael, I understand you've got a few comments from listeners of podcasts that you wanted to share today.
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you to all the people that have taken time to fill out a review on Apple Podcasts or any other format. Those are helpful, they're encouraging, but specifically some people wrote us, Brian, at info@restoringthesoul.com, and anyone listening that wants to give feedback for how the podcast has helped or for topics that they'd like to hear about can write info@restoringthesoul.com. But the first thing, it's easy for people who are listening to the Surfing for God podcast, these episodes, to think, well, my issue isn't with pornography, so I'm just going to kind of fast forward through this. But a woman wrote, and she's in full-time ministry, and she said that understanding the addictive, compulsive issues and ideas beneath pornography has helped her personally in issues related to what she described as being addicted to ministry, of always being busy, of always being at the church, of always needing another program. And so I just want to say these are universal issues, and that's why I'm glad we're doing the podcast. The second is that someone wrote, and I've heard this several times, but this was very dramatic. Somebody was listening to the podcast. They found it encouraging and helpful, but mostly they were getting equipped for the work that they were doing with others. And this person listened to about a half a dozen episodes related to shame and addiction, and then a loved one in their life was exposed with an addiction, and this person was able to speak into that and to the shame issues underneath. And it actually led to somebody getting the help that they needed. So it's so encouraging. And I'm so grateful for the impact that this podcast is having and for the ability for you and I to sit down and talk about these really important issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the email address is simply info@restoringthesoul.com. And on the website, you can also find a wide array of all of our podcasts. We have 180 episodes that we've done over the last couple years, wide-ranging topics. And I'm sure there's going to be something that could benefit you, the listener, or somebody who's in your life. But let's get back to the topic on hand, Michael. As I mentioned, for the next couple episodes, you're going to be focusing on your brain on porn. So why is it important to understand the effect of pornography on the brain?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because some people either are immediately drawn to this topic and skip everything else, or they feel like everything else in the book is important. And why focus on the brain? Because this is a spiritual issue. And number one, we are spiritual beings, but the soul, as I talk about again and again and again, is comprised of our body, our mind, our emotions, our will, and then our spirit. And so if we don't attend to the body, then our addictive, compulsive issues will only be addressed at a level that won't bring long-term freedom. So the brain is obviously the organ that mediates our spirituality and our emotionality and our relationality and ultimately our capacity to think and to choose. But pornography, as we'll learn, is really something like crack cocaine for the brain and highly addictive. But Brian, I was talking to a client years ago, it was years before I wrote Surfing for God, and he said to me, I know it's not really true, but I feel like my brain itself is conditioned by porn. And so even back then, without all of the neuroscience that we now have, I said, well, why do you think that that's not true? And he immediately said, well, I know it's just about that I'm choosing wrong. So when we understand the brain and pornography and the brain and addiction, even at a basic level, it's helpful to destigmatize that there's something wrong with us, and it's helpful to realize that healing is really a holistic approach and not just, I need to, quote, stop sinning or work harder to overcome this issue. Finally, it's important to talk about, because Surfing for God came out in 2012, and the brain science was really just emerging around pornography in particular and the brain and addiction in general. And since then, the science has simply exploded. And at the beginning of the podcast, I want to tell people to go to a website called yourbrainonporn.com. And I want to give a shout out to this website for two reasons. It's not a Christian website per se, but it is founded by the late Gary Wilson. And Gary was a high school teacher at one point and a specialist in the brain and anatomy. And he started hearing from men online that men in their 20s, and this was back in, I think, 2009 or 2010, that because of pornography, that they were no longer able to perform sexually. And physiologically, they were like they were elderly men. They couldn't become aroused. They couldn't maintain erections. And so they started to take Viagra and other kinds of medications like that. So Gary, as a scientist, started to scratch his head, and he had a pretty big online presence. And so originally, Your Brain on Porn, back in 2009 or 10, looked like a website from the 1980s, and it didn't have a lot there, but it became a clearinghouse of information for the brain. And now Gary passed just a few months ago, and I believe he was just around my age, and he had a chronic illness. But I want to honor him, because worldwide, Gary Wilson and yourbrainonporn.com really he was responsible for creating a movement, both secular and reinforcing the Christian approach. But here's why I want to honor him specifically. When I was writing Surfing for God, I reached out to him, a total stranger, at the time an unpublished author, and I said, here's who I am, here's what I'm doing, would you take a look at this chapter I had written? And so the chapter called Your Brain on Porn in the book, I asked him permission to use the title of his website. He gladly said yes. And he spent at least 3 hours reading the chapter, giving scientific feedback. I still have the document in a file somewhere, red ink, and just frankly chopped it up, but gave great feedback and helped me to write the chapter. And I wanted to pay him. He wouldn't accept any money. He said, you don't even have to credit me. And so just thank you to Gary Wilson and to the Lord for his life and how he has used him for Your Brain on Porn. So if people have more questions, want to go in deeper into the actual science of this, the references, journal annotations, it's all there. There's videos. And Gary has a famous TED Talk called The Great Porn Experiment.
Michael, how has the science of how pornography impacts the brain changed since you released Surfing for God in 2012?
The first thing is that the science, there's just been a proliferation of studies about pornography, in particular in professional and academic journals. There is a greater acceptance worldwide, even among the non-religious, that regardless of one's stance about pornography, whether it's, quote, sinful, whether it's helpful for couples, whether it's moral, there's now a general consensus with a small pushback community that porn is highly addictive and that it has a negative adverse impact in relationships, as well as a whole host of other adverse effects that we won't go into here.
So why don't we go ahead and jump in? You've got 7 key facts about porn and the brain, and I think it'd be a great opportunity for you to go through them. So how about we head into number 1 here, Michael, the number 1 key fact about the effect of porn on the brain.
Yeah, and then let's just take this episode just to go through these, and then in the follow-up episode, we'll talk about how to kind of move forward. Fact number 1, porn is a drug. Less now, but in previous years, I would hear clients say to me, well, pornography isn't really addictive. At least, not addictive the way that cocaine or alcohol or heroin can be. But nothing could be further from the truth. I want to take the time to read this paragraph from Mark Castleman, who wrote a book back in 2010 called The Drug of the New Millennium, How Internet Pornography Radically Alters the Human Brain. I've never come across any single paragraph that states this so clearly. So bear with me as I read these words from Mark Castleman. Instantaneously, an overpowering flood of chemicals is released in the brain. The viewer probably feels arousal and fear, lust and shock, excitement and shame, in a confusing blend that amounts to an emotional chemical cocktail. These chemicals virtually shut down the frontal lobes containing the logic center of the brain, the part of the brain that would normally say, wait a minute, are you sure you want to do this? The viewer's cognitive thought and reasoning abilities are overridden by the emotional gut reaction part of the brain called the limbic system. So the pleasure emotional center of the brain literally takes over. That exposure to porn lodges itself as an emotional memory before the viewer can take measures to stop it. No wonder a porn viewer often asks himself in bewilderment afterwards, what was I thinking? Well, that was certainly the case for me when I was addicted to porn and active in my sex addiction. So porn is a drug because it immediately releases these chemicals in our body in a way that is really on steroids. And the biggest piece that I want people to hear is that the drugs that we become addicted to and how porn is a drug is that these drugs are inside of our own body. And so we become addicted to our own brain chemistry. And that, again, can sound like really bad news, but it's good news because there's something we can do about it. And it helps us with this idea that it's not just me not trying hard enough.
Okay, let's hit number 2 then, the key fact about porn and the brain.
Well, related to the brain, there is all kinds of science that says that pornography has harmful consequences. I'll often hear the question, and certainly now in the secular world, but actually in the Christian world, what's the big deal? It's not so harmful, is it? And there's a whole host of social and cultural issues around the harm of porn in terms of how it can fuel sex trafficking, and certainly how it fuels misogyny. But in a number of studies, men who regularly use porn reported decreased self-confidence and self-esteem, increased sense of depression and loneliness. They describe being less passionate and less engaged with life in general. And on the social and relational front, they became more isolated and less likely to initiate romantic relationships. In Surfing for God, in an earlier chapter, I share the true story of while I was writing the book, I drove through a major intersection in downtown Denver, and this giant billboard said, in relation to advertising this local adult bookstore that sold porn DVDs, it said, 99-cent DVDs, cheaper than dating, ! And it stunned me to think, okay, I will step back from my desire for a real relationship and whatever that might cost me financially or relationally, and I'll just indulge in porn and kind of settle. So those are some of the symptoms, and I already mentioned erectile dysfunction in men in their teens and 20s, but also, as we'll talk about, there are specific harmful consequences in terms of how it rewires the brain.
Why don't we take a look at number 3, the key fact about porn and the brain, and that'll take us right up to a break.
Yes, I did not originate this phrase, but the phrase I'll use for fact number 3 is that porn hijacks the brain, which is to say that it overstimulates the brain chemistry. It can affect and does affect all that we want and how much we want it. Most listeners will probably hear, they will have heard about the chemical called dopamine, and that's known as the gotta have it molecule or the gimme, gimme, gimme molecule. And it's a neurotransmitter that's associated with pleasure and reward, and it's the gas for our desire engine. So imagine eating at your favorite restaurant or going on vacation. And you and I both talked about before the show going on vacation coming up next week. So imagine if we hit pause and we just imagined ourselves on vacation, or you who are a foodie at your favorite restaurant. And what would happen is there would be certain chemicals, pleasure chemicals, that would begin to be released in our brain. But because of the power of the sexual experience with pornography, and because of the infinite amount of novelty, that there's always more different, more intense, more illicit, closer to the edge of what's allowed, that novelty and that being able to push forward allows the viewer to overcome the issue of tolerance. Every addiction has tolerance and withdrawal. And tolerance is basically that you need more and more to get the same effect. Well, with cocaine or even alcohol, I have to have the money to go get that, or I have to have access to go get that. But with pornography, in a 10-minute session, I can get more and more with greater and greater novelty and intensity in a way that overstimulates my brain, and it creates a whole series of changes in the brain that actually rewire and then prevent us from just saying, I don't want to do this anymore.
It's amazing to hear, Michael, these points you're making at how literally destructive porn is to the brain. And we've got a few more key facts that we're going to dive into after the break. You're listening to Restoring the Soul. I'm your producer, Brian Beatty, and we'll be back in just a minute.
You already know we live in a pornified world, but most of us are at a loss for how to navigate this sea of temptation. It's either ceaseless striving on the one hand or giving in to brokenness on the other. But doesn't the gospel offer us another way? The truth is that our sexual struggles are not actually about sex, but about a misdirected, God-given longing for deep connection. Dig deeper in my book, Surfing for God, Discovering the Divine Desire Beneath Sexual Struggle.
Welcome back to Restoring the Soul. I'm your producer, Brian Beatty, along with your host, Michael John Cusick, and we are in the first of two parts of an episode called Your Brain on Porn. And Michael, we're at number 4 now, the key facts about porn and the brain. Take us there.
Yeah, number 4 is that we talked about the pornography overstimulates the brain or hijacks it. And when that happens, when the overstimulation is there, the brain is rewired and changed. And so the overstimulating causes the release of too much dopamine. And then when there's too much dopamine, the brain adapts to this overstimulation. And then that adaptation causes the brain to change and rewire itself in 3 ways. And most listeners are going to go, oh, that's why this happens. So the first of these changes results in cravings. And it's important to say that cravings are not just desires. Cravings are physiological, intense urges to watch, to view, to engage with more pornography. And the cravings occur because as dopamine is released, we want more and more and more. And so that leads to watching more porn, but then that leads to more dopamine release, which leads to more craving, which leads to more porn, and you get the idea. The vicious cycle goes around and around. But because of this idea of tolerance, the more that the brain builds up tolerance, the less likely or less ability we have to actually feel satisfied and to enjoy it. So we need it more and more, but we like it less and less, and we can't stop using. And so it's always like, you can think of it this way, it's like always being hungry and eating whenever you're feeling hungry, which is always, but never feeling full. And therefore, if you never feel full, you're hungry, and so you have to eat, and the cycle goes around and around. And if people take a moment and stop and think about this, it's really very, very profound that has a spiritual corollary, that we have these longings in our heart, and when we turn to anything that's not God or one of His good gifts, like an intimate relationship, then it may provide pleasure, but it doesn't have that real connection where we can be known, and therefore it's not going to satisfy. There's a third change. Actually, the second change I think I just covered, but it's around the change in the reward circuit between the part of the brain that controls urges and desires that say, go for it, and the logical, rational part of the brain that says, whoa, slow down, think about this. So in that reward circuitry and the what we might call self-control circuitry, there's a breakdown there. And ideally, it works where it's synced up and it's in harmony, so that when the craving or the urge beckons, the rational brain says, let's see if this is a good idea. You're in recovery, or you don't want to dishonor your wife or whoever it is that you're in relationship with. And again, it's always important for me to say all of these issues are as real for women with pornography as it can be for men. But when the brain is saying, I'm not so sure this is a good idea, the pornography and the dopamine, you can think of it this way, it trips the circuit breaker. So the go for it, let's do this, I've got to have this part of the brain is overstimulated because of the dopamine, and the think about it, let's not do this part of the brain reacts to the dopamine overload and it shuts down. So there's a part of the brain that's got to have it, let's do this, that revs up, and then the part that can actually control and evaluate shuts down. So it's like turning up the volume on all of your friends yelling in your ear saying, hey, let's go party, and turning down the volume on the part of you that says, no, that's not what I want to do tonight. I have a final exam in the morning and I need to stay back and study. The very final part of this brain, the third change in the brain as a result of this overstimulation, is a numbed pleasure response. So the dopamine gets too high, and if it's too high for too long, the neurons in the brain lose their ability to communicate. And you can think about it this way. Nerve cells are sending the dopamine and they're screaming, more dopamine, while the receiving nerve cells put their hands over their ears. They cover their ears. And so the sending cells are screaming louder and louder, more dopamine, more, until they lose their voice and they can only then whisper. And then the receiving cells become deaf and can't hear, and then the sending cells can only whisper, and then the receiving cells can hear less and less. And really, it's about too much of a good thing diminishes the ability to enjoy the good thing, and that's wired into the brain.
We're up to number 5 now here, Michael, the key facts about porn and the effects on the brain. What do we have for number 5?
Well, it's a summary of what I've been saying so far, and that number 5 is that porn creates an addicted brain. If someone watches porn long enough, and it's so common for me to talk to folks, when were you first exposed to porn? Well, when I was 9, or when I was 10, or 12, and it's rarely any more later than that. But when a person's looking at it over time, the brain actually adapts and it becomes addicted. So when people say, I'm not addicted, there's actually a medical, neurological reality to what that is. But it's this feeling that without watching more porn, I'm going to feel awful, irritable, depressed, empty, lonely. And the addiction is to their own brain chemistry. And this is why in therapy and in the world of recovery from porn and sex addiction, but porn in particular, why we call it visual crack cocaine. So it's important for people to know, as I talk about porn creates an addicted brain, that everything we do, think, and feel has a corresponding pathway in the brain. And so as the brain's reward circuits are struggling for this harmony, the brain rewires itself by creating new pathways where it's not harmony. And every time the person looks at another pornographic image, and this is certainly what was happening with me through all of my sex addiction, the dopamine burst that comes by engaging with or even thinking about the sexual behavior, it strengthens the connection between pathways for addiction. So the more we do it, whatever the behavior is, sexually speaking, the stronger the pathway becomes. And this is an analogy that Gary Wilson gave me from Your Brain on Porn and gave me permission to say this. But you can think of the pathways in your brain as footpaths of waist-high grass. And there's a place where our family goes to the beach where the apartment or the condo is on one side of this tall seagrass, and then there's a path that goes between the seagrass to the water. Well, when the grass is high it requires a lot of effort to walk through that path. And the government might have little signs there that say, stay out of this because there's sea turtles and stuff, or make sure you go down a half a mile to that little cut through, but people walk through it anyway. But when the grass is high, it requires a lot of effort to walk through. But every time you walk through that grass, it gets trampled down and it takes less effort. And eventually it becomes a path of sand or dirt. But what happens with addiction, it not only causes the grass to wear down faster, it's like taking a weed eater through that grass so that there is a path that happens very, very, very quickly. And so for the addict, despite their best intentions, there is an inability to resist, to say no, or to stop oneself.
Michael, it begs the question, at least for me, and so I apologize that this was an unplanned question, but the damage that happens to the brain, is it permanent? When you talk about a rewiring, is that something that somebody will end up suffering through the rest of their lives? Or does it just kind of fade away, get back to normal? Or does it require then the professional rewiring and help and therapy?
Yeah, that's the question of the hour. And so let's call that fact number 6. And that's that porn-addicted brains, and even brains that are addicted to substances like cocaine, opioids, and heroin or other kinds of drugs, those addicted brains can be rewired to health. So for the listener, whether it's a sexual addiction or a porn addiction in particular, just like a computer can be rebooted and the hard drive can be reset, brains can be rebooted and reset to healthy functioning. And in other words, using the analogy of the seagrass, the grass can grow back. And I have seen that in my own life, in my own body and brain, and I've seen it in countless people that I've worked with. But this rebooting is like giving your brain a timeout. There's a phrase that you can't overhaul an engine without actually stopping the engine. And so this is like giving your brain a timeout in the same way that you would shut off the engine. But there's a chicken and egg kind of issue here, where how do you shut off the engine? And so framing this not as simply I'm going to use my will and flex my muscle to reboot and stop, but I'm actually going to be rewiring my brain and shutting it down. And that's where, again, the website Your Brain on Porn that Gary Wilson put together can be super helpful. But we'll talk about this in the second podcast, that there's a plan, there's a specific way that you can reboot and begin to rewire your brain, but it's definitely possible.
Man, just fascinating information. Michael, thank you. We've got one more. Point number 7, key facts about porn in the brain. What are we at with number 7?
Yeah, it's related to the previous one of the fact that porn-addicted brains can be rewired. But number 7 is basically there is hope for porn addiction of all kinds. This is an issue that can be overcome. And I know there's listeners, whether it's a person who's actually struggling with the porn addiction or a loved one, who have said, I'm not so sure because I've been wrestling with this since I was a kid and I'm now in my 40s and I've tried everything and nothing helps. But, the heart and soul of this podcast is the story of God that he reveals in the scriptures. And that's the story that Jesus is making all things new. I love the verse in Isaiah 43 where it says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? Do you not see it spring up? I am making streams in the wasteland." And so no matter how deep or how long someone has struggled, what's true is that God longs to make all things new in you. I believe that he has already made a path for us and that there is real hope for real change. And in the next episode, we're going to talk about how that happens.
So we've wrapped up another episode of Restoring the Soul. We want you to know that Restoring the Soul is so much more than a podcast. In fact, the heart of what we have done for nearly 20 years is intensive counseling. When you can't wait months or years to get out of the rut you're in, our intensive counseling programs in Colorado allow you to experience deep change in half-day blocks over 2 weeks. To learn more, visit restoringthesoul.com. That's restoringthesoul.com.